Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Grey Matter Talks Tech, our podcast for IT pros and developers looking for the latest insights and tips from the world of tech. I'm Leanne Bevan, Vendor Marketing Manager and Customer Insight Lead at Grey Matter. I'm delighted to once again welcome our Azure Solutions Specialist, Sam Barnes, to the podcast for a chat around cloud adoption and the key principles that organisations should follow. So welcome, Sam. Welcome to Season 4 of our podcast.
Hi, Leanne. Yeah, it's come around again, right? It's feels like only yesterday we were doing one of these.
Of course, yeah, time certainly is flying. So let's kick off then. Many businesses have already adopted the cloud or maybe followed a hybrid approach. For those that haven't yet, why should they consider moving to the cloud? What are the benefits?
Yeah, I mean, so this is actually a conversational question that comes up quite a lot, and I guess the age-old reason for moving to cloud was cloud is infinite, essentially. So you've got infinite scalability, you've got the ability to be reliable, you've got the latest and greatest in cybersecurity, and all of those are still technically the case in the sense that you can now scale up to more powerful machines or add extra machines for capacity, or you can add disaster recovery into your setup, and even deploy the latest and greatest of cybersecurity solutions like Defender or Sentinel and others. But I guess the biggest thing that I tend to see is that it also gives you an easier management plane. So I think for a lot of businesses that are maybe tiptoeing into the world of cloud, that's probably going to be their biggest area that they'll notice of it becoming a lot easier to manage. Now, it depends on how they adopt cloud. As all things, it's how you do it, not what you're doing. Because no one's going to just suddenly go into Azure and go, hey, I want to take advantage of all the AI technology there is without covering the fundamentals. But once you do those, essentially the possibilities are endless, and we're starting to see Microsoft now add more and more of these capabilities to their offering. Certainly on the AI front, it seems to be that's the most popular area of investment for them right now. So that's actually quite powerful. I think the other area that and I think it's an undervalued area actually, but another area that I see quite a lot of benefit for partners is if you are used to deploying infrastructure, it can often take time. The cloud now gives you that ability to actually bring time of deployment right down. Now, whether that's actually, doing infrastructure as code so that everything's laid out for you and it's repeatable. Also, you can think of it from a development point of view as well. So if you've got, I don't know, GitHub or Azure DevOps as your choice of repo, you can now connect that in with some of the services, so like Azure App Services, and effectively push those updates straight through to deployment or straight through to production, just making it so much easier now than ever before. So I think it depends on what you're coming at it from. If you're a seasoned veteran, maybe you're going to be a little bit further down that track, but anyone net new, there's probably quite a lot there really for you to start taking advantage of.
Yes, there's so many different areas and services, and depending on which angle or department you're coming from as well. So bringing it back to the basics then, what are the key principles for cloud adoption?
That's a great question. So funnily enough, Microsoft, and I feel like I've been saying this for some time now, but Microsoft have a specific framework to encapsulate all of this, which is called the Cloud Adoption Framework. Ultimately, what that will do is it will give you that roadmap from start to finish with measurable sort of pit stops along the way. So if you are completely new to cloud as an offering, the recommendation is to start with the basics. So strategize the reason why. Why am I adopting cloud? What's in it for me? The kind of the selfish ambition, I guess. And that, I think, actually brings it back to what is the business trying to achieve? What's its objectives? Do they want to be able to offer a solution to anyone within any different geopolitical region? Do they want to have the most secure solution? Do they want to have a solution that actually leverages the latest and greatest in AI technology so that they can boast about it? Once you kind of go through those conversations, and by the way, they're not something that happens overnight. This can be quite a number of weeks to be done properly. But once you've gone through those conversations, what you'll be left with is essentially a fully ready-made step plan of what you need to do. So, what are we moving away from? How much is that costing us now? What is all the capability now? And what's all the management now? And then what are we going to? And who's responsible for it? And I guess what needs to adjust within our business, whether that be from a training perspective or maybe an actual just getting the organization ready. So actually setting up different processes. And so that then takes you through them. Now, I'd have to say that the adoption framework goes beyond that, and I'm sure we can cover those in a bit more depth. But it's very much it's not a linear process. You don't just go from A to C. You actually have to do this on a repetitive process if you want to get it right. And I'd actually encourage any business, even if they've been using Azure for years, is just periodically go back and recover those steps, or if they're bringing new workloads into the cloud, recover those steps. They are really important, but they can make all the difference when it comes to adoption. And I think then the second half of that question, which was the kind of the key principles, and it's ones that often I see being, I don't want to say not done properly, but certainly not necessarily done to the best of ability, is actually ongoing management and governance. And I think the main reason for that is time. There's so many things that are changing. We live in a world now where technology is almost redundant. After about 6 months, you've got to constantly be adjusting and improving, right? But certainly the ongoing governance is crucial, whether that be putting in place those guardrails with policies, or whether or not that's actually deciding what you want to monitor in your application or indeed your infrastructure, so that you're not just switching everything on and charging a big bill to your credit card, that sort of thing. So I think those are kind of the key areas. And then the last piece of the puzzle, I think, is security, which I know we cover quite a lot. But it's something that we're now seeing, rather than it just being a shift left mentality. So in other words, moving it from kind of production to development, we're now actually seeing it being secure by design is actually the recommendation. And actually that starts right at the planning stage and the strategic stage. Is, what are you actually hoping to achieve? Is it meeting all of your security benchmarks that you need it to? Because if you've got the greatest solution in the world, or you've got the best AI solution in the world, ultimately if it's not secure, it doesn't account for much. So as I said, we could probably cover that in more detail, but that's ultimately what I see with the principles.
Yeah, so it seems like it's all about making sure all the different stakeholders come together and really evaluate the past, the present, and the future, and kind of everyone's roles within that, and kind of how everything's going to affect and what they need to put in place to make it work as effectively as possible then.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting you mentioned that, kind of having everybody in one room is that's actually covered off in the framework. So Microsoft's terminology for it, and anyone that's been on a call with me has probably heard me say it before, is having that cloud center of excellence is crucial. And it doesn't have to be a big team. I know sometimes Microsoft documentation can almost look like it's meant for the enterprise, not the SMB market. But the interesting thing with that particular sort of train of thought that they're bringing forward is that actually a center of excellence team could only be made up of like 1 or 2, 3 people. Ultimately, the core principle behind it is who's taking ownership of what we've got, and more importantly, how are they articulating that to the business? Because that could be done by an architect just as easy as it could be done by someone from finance or a CEO. So it's about understanding and aligning those roles and responsibilities. And actually, I think the biggest kind of job that they have is advocating for the success that they have once they've moved to cloud. So not just saying this is what we're going to do, but this is what we've done. Look at how awesome our solution is. This is now going to enable us to serve this particular customer. And that's actually one of the biggest areas that I think people could do well to kind of take on board in terms of cloud adoption.
Yeah, that's great. And just elaborating on that a bit more, how do you translate these different things you've mentioned into practical steps for a customer who feels maybe overwhelmed or perhaps doesn't know where to start with this sort of project?
Sure, yeah, that's a great question. Do you know what? It's going to sound silly, but it's take your time. I think nowadays there's a danger that if you're not first to the pile, you're going to be last, and that's not strictly true. I always say 2 hours taken saves 2 hours running around. Sorry, 2 minutes taken even saves 2 hours running around. And what that actually means is if we're doing things in logical steps, so understanding what our objectives actually are, essentially mapping out what that return of investment looks like, we're more able to kind of elevate these processes. And you'll find that actually the adoption process will go a lot quicker and a lot easier, as opposed to doing things, just as and when they come up. And actually that's probably massively true from a security perspective, where if you leave everything to production, you're probably going to find out the hard way that something's gone wrong. But if you have managed to kind of cut it off before any issues, you might have a longer job to actually remediate. So doing it at the very beginning, taking your time, understanding what's actually happening, and strategically aligning what you want to do and how you want to use Azure is especially good. I think also maybe applying logic to the situation as well. So the cloud adoption framework is a really good framework if you want to kind of go A, B, C, D, E. And that speaks to me because I'm quite attention to detail. But actually what it does do is it says to you, don't just throw resources into the cloud without having an understanding of how they're going to connect. It will force you as an institution to understand, are we doing this for speed? As in, do we want to just set resources up with our minimum viable product? As in, maybe we want to have it with backup, but maybe not disaster recovery at this stage. Or maybe we want to understand baseline security, but we're not so fussed on the granular pieces. We'll come to that later. Or if you're going for a specific tender or there's specific requirements on you from compliance mindsets, then maybe you need to have everything in place from the very beginning. And it teaches businesses to kind of prioritize what's important to them. So depending on how you want to do it, I would say that's the practical step, is understand what the end goal is and what you can physically do to get there. And then I suppose the last piece of the puzzle is avoiding distractions. They're really easy to fall into.
Sure.
It's something we see quite a lot with, certainly as there's more and more calls for innovation, is, well, we're in the cloud now, we need to do an AI solution. And you sort of like, okay, that's fine. But actually what we probably should be thinking about is, have we optimized things in the most sensible way? Because, if we're hemorrhaging money, adding another solution to that can only make it worse. And we might actually counteract any of the benefits we would have got. So probably something I should have mentioned is that within the cloud adoption framework is an ongoing process that businesses should follow, which is called, rather conveniently, the well-architected framework. And it's something that actually businesses, when they're adopting Azure, they can start to set up their resources, and then they can use that second framework to actually go, now that we're here, what's important to us? What matters to us? Do we need to have a highly performing solution? Do we need to have a really secure solution? And I know anyone listening to this is probably screaming at it now, going, well, everything's important. And that really is true. But if you break it down to the kind of the underlying fundamentals, is that, yes, we want everything to be super secure, but if we enable absolutely everything, we may outcost the benefits that we're going to get. So we might have to trade off against some of the priorities that we've got. If security is the most important, that's fine, but maybe cost is going to take a bit of a hit. If we need to look at performance and reliability, then maybe we can't do something else. And just understanding how they fit together will help you as you go along that journey. And it's all part of the framework, which is the great news. So you can just follow it from step by step.
So where do most organizations actually go wrong when starting the cloud adoption journey, and how does the cloud adoption framework actually help prevent those pitfalls from happening?
Yes. I guess from my perspective, and I don't think this is the truth for every business out there, but certainly from my perspective, the biggest area of focus where they go wrong is not having that center of excellence. And we kind of touched on this a little bit previously, but that center of excellence team is ultimately going to be the driving force behind the adoption process. They're normally the ones that are advising of skilling gaps, for example, or what costs are coming into play, or where we are in terms of actually doing the migration. And certainly something that we see when migrating, and again, this is part of the framework if people want to go and see it, is it's not all going to be done in one hit. It's not like click a button and everything moves. There's going to be things to consider. But the recommendation is to do it in a phased approach. You might find that one particular workload is the most important because it gives you the biggest return of investment. Well, okay, that's fine. It's going to take up a little bit of our focus, but then how do we get the business ready to then undertake the next workload? Because we don't want to just start and stop all the time. How do we make sure that if we have got numerous iterations going on, how do we make sure that we don't actually overcomplicate things or oversaturate our teams so that they can't do things in a sensible fashion? So this center of excellence team really is crucial, and what they'll be doing in behind the scenes. And by the way, these probably are people that are maybe in support or solution specialists or IT admins, for example. They're probably already aware of some of the things that need to be done, but the whole reason this center of excellence team exists is to make sure that each independent viewpoint is brought to the table. Because if you've got somebody from development saying, well, I need this, but actually the production or the platform team are going, that's fine, but we haven't got the opportunity to do that, you can cause a bottleneck. So being able to prioritize what needs to happen and in what order is normally done by this team, and they'll bring those viewpoints into play to make sure that everyone gets behind it. but also to make sure that it's done sensibly. So that's normally where I see things with difficulty, that finding difficulty with the actual adoption process. It has to also be said, I guess, cost is normally the other one.
Of course. Yeah.
It's fun having to cost things out in Azure, and anyone using the Azure pricing calculator will probably testify to that. I guess it's once you're in the cloud, in whatever capacity that is, whether this is your final iteration or whether or not this is your stepping stone architecture, is triaging those costs on an ongoing basis, and that's sometimes something that we see not happening as often as we would expect. And I mean, we've brought solutions in play, such as Surveil, to actually bolster that, because there's lots and lots of demands now on people's time. So understanding at a granular level what your costs actually are doing, but then more importantly how you can optimize them and remove the wastage, is now more crucial than ever. So I think that's certainly something that needs to be looked at by businesses. And in terms of how the adoption framework prevents those pitfalls, well, as I say, it gives you measurable stepping stones. So, you start with your strategizing, you then move into planning. Alongside the planning, you're then getting the team ready to actually set the platform up, so that when the migration physically happens, it's got something to go to, but also what it's going to is secure by default, highly performing, reliable, and isn't costing you the F. So you can see how these sorts of things are starting to fit together, in that the excellence team will be that driving force, but the framework is very much the mode of transportation. It's very much what's guiding businesses to do it. Anyone using it properly may find that they're not necessarily going to go through every single stage in order.
Mm-hmm.
And this is probably more true of the latter stages of the framework than perhaps the beginning phases. So where we see management and governance coming in and probably secure, those may be something that happens out of order. Maybe actually security is more important and you want to fix that first, or at least tighten the screws before you look at more monitoring. Maybe actually you want to know what you're looking for before you do anything else, and so monitoring takes precedence. And then even once you've done that, where there's maybe updates or additions within Azure, you may have to come back and revisit it. So I think the framework really does give you those measurable steps to kind of go, well, this is where we were and this is now where we are, and that's what makes it so powerful, really.
Yeah, and does that mean as well that even people that have already adopted the cloud or perhaps a hybrid approach can start using this framework too? It's not just people who are totally new to the cloud experience.
Yeah, 100%. In fact, I would say there's almost a danger of people thinking it's a one and done. Like, I've moved to the cloud, I used the framework, I did what I was supposed to, and now I'm fine. Actually, if we're doing things sensibly, we would use it over and over again. And that well-architected framework that I mentioned, which is part of Cloud Adoption Framework, is actually something that's recommended by Microsoft to do as a repetitive process. So their recommendation is every time your workloads change, we should be doing one of these assessments. We should be actually understanding what's our priority, what's our focus, what means the most to us, how do we optimize, and that might change. And so if you're doing it every time you change your workload, then it might be that 1 month is performance and the next month is security based on need. But for businesses that are kind of taking that approach, I mean, their workload is likely to change a lot. And so we recommend doing it on a regular cadence. Roughly every 6 months is probably about right, because it gives you enough chance for things to change without you being glued to an assessment and death by Excel and stuff like that. But that should be enough to actually do it with. And funnily enough, that's exactly what our teams do in our solutions team, is they'll utilize that framework when they're conducting either designs or whether they're doing health checks for customers. And ultimately, they'll understand what's important. So, okay, based on what we see, here's where you could tighten up on security, or here's where you could actually reduce your cost. Now, I think from my perspective, having that kind of thing in a report is one thing, and it's really important. The more important and the more beneficial piece for a business, if they are undertaking those reviews with our team, is actually the after piece, is when they jump back on the call with the engineer or the architect and say, right, okay, I understand we can reduce cost here, but what's that going to impact? Or do we need to be mindful if we change something in the next 6 months? Or, okay, that's fine with regards to security, but we lack that capability. How can you possibly help? And that's not always something that necessarily has to be an ongoing engagement. It might be an alternative solution. I think part of using these sorts of frameworks is even Microsoft themselves admit you don't necessarily have to put all eggs in one basket. You might decide that rather than using a existing solution or a Microsoft solution, using an alternative, retiring something that you have to physically put effort into in favor of something that another business contributes for you. And we see that quite a lot with cybersecurity. So, it's very much there. And I would say that's probably something that businesses would do well, is that, take advantage of those after conversations and potentially even ongoing engagements.
Yeah, and I've seen like a lot of customers I speak to as well, they maybe don't have the resource to do everything internally. So it is important to lean on those experts and make sure things like security are covered best they can by the experts, and knowing that everything's done to the best ability is really important. And you also mentioned about other tools there, like earlier you mentioned Surveil. Could you tell us a bit more about what Surveil is and how that can help a client when they're moving to the cloud?
Yeah, of course. So anyone's not familiar with it, Surveil is essentially a FinOps tool. FinOps is the blending of finance and operations teams. Ultimately, the goal of the tool is to make sure that finance are still accountable for the money spent, but aren't hindering the actual ability to deploy in the cloud. And that's something that's quite important. And what you can actually physically do using Surveil is you can break down at a granular level, whether that be the subscription, the resource group, or even the resource, and understand, what's this costing me? And that's really helpful, because it means that, especially if you want to build out return of investment on a workload or an application, you can do that. And this is something that we're probably going to see an awful lot more happening over the next coming years. So that's the kind of the first piece of the puzzle. It does really nicely. The second piece is, once we understand what we've got, is how do we actually remove things that we don't need? And sometimes that triggers a conversation with modernization. So an obvious example being, we've got a whole heap of VMs in the cloud. How do we optimize that so that we don't have to use Bastion to actually remote into them, which is costing us a couple £100? Well, actually, maybe you could use an app service plan. And what that would do is it would not only reduce your management overhead, but potentially also reduce your physical costs as well over time. There are also a whole heap of other benefits. Like I mentioned earlier, you can have a speedier time to deployment. You can use app services to physically push through those updates. So those are the sorts of things that you can highlight by actually just understanding what things are costing you. The next kind of step with that optimization is then, could we maybe look at performance, or could we maybe look at high availability to actually understand whether we can make improvements there? And it's always a conversation starter, because inevitably recommendations that not often come up will be, we need to add more resilience into our disks, for example, so that we're not just doing it locally, but maybe we want to do it across a region or maybe several regions. And that's fine, but then we have to account for the extra costs. So the platform is really helpful, because what it does is it starts the conversation of, well, this is where you can think of your focus, and this is then where you need to actually spend a bit of time. And where it actually works quite nicely with things like Cloud Adoption Framework is, Surveil as a platform highlights the conversation. The well-architected framework then brings what the outcome of that conversation could or should be, so that businesses can start to use it. And then the last piece of that platform is that you can then continuously monitor different KPIs. So whether this is understanding admin access in your environment, or what policies have changed so that you can make sure that your policy initiatives are up to date, or maybe it's actually understanding whether or not there's different workloads that are contributing to a greater demand on our monitoring solution, those sorts of things. So that's kind of really kind of ticking the box then in the latter stages of cloud adoption, because we're helping ourselves to continuously monitor, to continuously govern, and to continuously secure our environment. Born out of FinOps, but very much now delivering that end-to-end cloud adoption framework mindset.
And I think that really aligns with some research that I've been doing. I recently launched an annual survey asking people about things like their challenges and different things. And optimization of costs and the cloud, as well as security, were all up there as kind of the main priorities and the main challenges that people had. And it seems here that this framework really does help you tick all of those boxes to make sure that you're optimizing costs, staying more secure whilst in the cloud. Yeah, it's really good to see that it covers that. And so what does success look like after implementing the cloud framework? And how do you measure that success over time?
Yeah, so I mean, that's a hard question to answer, because I guess it depends on the perspective that you're looking at it from. So in terms of actually, once you've implemented the adoption framework and you've actually adopted cloud, your success will be governed by whatever your objectives were in the first stage. So was the initial success to have a highly performing solution that didn't cost the earth? the initial benefit of cloud, which is removing expensive hardware and actually removing wastage for things that we don't need, or right sizing what we did because perhaps we over provisioned on premise. Maybe that was your initial goal, and actually that will then probably tick the box in terms of success. Maybe it's actually in the latter stages, you've been on the cloud for years and you've got it all under control and everything's super secure and governed to the maximum. Maybe success to you is, well, we now want to deliver something that's got innovation behind it. So maybe we want to push an AI agent into our solution so that it's easier for our clients. Maybe we want to, actually have the ability of gaining greater analytics. Maybe we want to deploy faster. So I guess the answer to the question really depends on what you're trying to achieve. And to the kind of second point there, with it being, how does implementing CAF help that, is it filters the mind, it filters what your actual objectives are. And as I said, this is 100% something that you can do time and time again. So it's not just use it to go to Azure. It's once you're on Azure, use it continuously, because you can then start to strategically place your investment in the right areas. And what you will find is, you'll go there quicker, but you'll also do it in a secure fashion, which is ultimately the most important thing. You'll get a better experience with doing it that way. So that's normally what I would say to a partner who's asking that question. But I think it's very much down to understanding what that looks like for you. I guess I'd also tag on to the end of that is documenting what that is, not just from a due diligence point of view, but also because as a team you can shout about it, you can share your success. This is what we've managed to do. We've pushed out 10 updates more than what we did 2 years ago, or we've managed to involve this particular solution in our capability, or maybe we've become more secure and so we've had less incidents, or something to that effect. And that's important for morale and for kind of shared accomplishments. So just documenting what those are,
and also for ROI, I guess, and just to kind of showcase to the larger stakeholders, okay, this is working now, can we have more investment to push into this particular project? Now we've got extra time or resource or funding to do that. So yeah, it's really good.
very much.
And we've spoken about the framework, but how does it physically work? Is it a spreadsheet? Is it something on Azure that you go through as a guide? Like, how do we access it and go through it?
Good question. Well, the framework itself is essentially a set of Microsoft Learn documents. Businesses can go to the Microsoft Learn site and start to kind of peruse through. What I will say is it can be a little bit of a dull and dry read. I'm not one for constantly sitting there and reading through documents. I'm a bit more of a hands-on kind of a guy.
Yeah.
And for that reason, Microsoft do also provide assessments that can be done as well. And these are essentially just tick box answers that will give you essentially a readiness score, which is helpful, but I guess without context can sometimes leave people a little bit confused. So there's different ways that you can do it. I think most people tend to just rely on the documentation and do it slowly, but those are ultimately the two ways that we see.
Great, thank you. And finally, how does Grey Matter support SaaS companies, software development companies, and others with cloud adoption?
Yeah, so actually in quite a sensible way. So ultimately you can come and have a conversation with me. More than happy to impart a little bit of knowledge. We do actually run a cloud adoption framework readiness assessment, which isn't death by Excel, but ultimately what it is normally a 90-minute session with myself. It's a friendly conversation, so it's understanding what works for your business, what you're doing now, what your successes are now, and essentially what your motivations for moving to cloud are likely to be. Within that, there's obviously more granular conversation around security, governance, compliance, that sort of thing. But the output really is you get a business modeling template. So this is using, if anyone's familiar with it, the Strategizer framework, to kind of piece together your value proposition so that you really understand how technology aligns to your business to create success. But it will also then highlight areas of focus. So perhaps, where we've moved from an on-premise environment and network segregation and kind of endpoint management has been key, we're now having to kind of shift that focus more into identity, and maybe there's a weakness there, in which case that will be flagged. And so we can sort of say, well, we need to strategize about maybe training because people are doing things in a certain way, or we need to look at the security implementation because of the way things have been configured. I won't cover everything in that because ultimately going through a whole adoption framework normally would take me a 2 day to do as a full workshop with a client, but I'm more than happy to do that if that's something that's of benefit. But the initial assessment for 90 minutes, I think, is quite powerful because it, again, filters the mind. So we've kind of borrowed the core, if you like, feel the kind of the soul of their cloud adoption framework to make sure that partners understand how they can adopt Azure in a meaningful way.
Brilliant. And is there anything else that you think our listeners should know about cloud adoption or Microsoft Azure in general, or even Grey Matter?
I guess the only thing I would say is you don't know what you don't know.
Yeah.
It sounds like a little bit of a get out of jail free card, but but my general experience is that clients will often come to me with a different scenario based on where they're at in that journey. So if this is net new to you, perhaps we'll cover everything. But for people that have been there for years, maybe actually what you need is a FinOps tool. So we can come and we can leverage Surveil for you. Perhaps what you need is to have a business continuity plan. Well, yeah, I can 100% cover that and what Azure brings to the party. But what we find works really well is actually working and liaising with people throughout the business. So anyone that's familiar to this podcast has probably heard our cybersecurity expert, Scott. Scott and I work really closely together, and not everything has to be a Microsoft solution, but consequently, not everything has to be a third-party solution. Just understanding where those lines and where those boundaries lie are quite helpful for partners. So come and have a conversation. Come and tell us what you're doing so that we can support you. Chances are we've got something that will be there and be good, but it's just making sure we get the right fit so that we don't fall into the trap of making everything a hammer.
Yeah, of course. So yeah, thank you ever so much again, Sam, for joining me on the podcast again and
Pleasure.
delving into the various cloud adoption principles. It's been really interesting. And for anyone listening, if you do have any questions or want to chat to Sam more about your project, you can get in touch by emailing info@greymatter.com. We've got lots of great more episodes coming up all about cloud and AI, so make sure to subscribe so you don't miss out. Bye for now.